without further ado, please welcome Dr. John van Wyhe.
Thank you. I apologize in advance for having a little tickle in my throat, but hopefully it won't affect me. Well, Darwin and Wallace, are famous figures in the history of science. Charles Darwin being much more famous. And the theme I want to talk along this evening is that even though historical figures can be very well known, it would be a mistake to think that we know everything about them and that we're finished and that there's nothing more to know, or to think that we already know we have everything right, because often turns out that we don't have everything right. So I'll concentrate first on my most recent book, which is Darwin in Cambridge, on Darwin's student life. This is an episode of Darwin's life. Many biographies have been written about him, but the part about his student life in Cambridge was very thin, and it turned out very inaccurate. So let's just start with the old man. This is how we always remember Charles Darwin, the old bearded man. But I want you to think instead of a younger fellow. That's him on the left. The first portrait of him as a little boy with his sister, already with a pot of flowers on his lap, I think indicating some interest in natural history. Well, the Darwins were a very well-to-do family in a small Midlands town called Shrewsbury in the middle of England. And Darwin was sent to the nearby Shrewsbury Free Grammar School, which was one of the best schools in England in those days. Although the curriculum was mostly classical, Darwin didn't like it very much, didn't work very hard. And his father decided that he would take him out a little bit early and send him to the University of Edinburgh, which was the premier place to study medicine in the UK in those days. And that was, of course, to follow in his father's footsteps. His father was a physician, very, very wealthy one. He also lent money. I think he made more money doing that than being a physician. And his father before him had been a physician, the famous Erasmus Darwin, the philosopher. So it was natural that young Charles Darwin was expected to become a physician, but he had two very strong disqualifications for that. He couldn't stand the sight of blood. I mean, not even a skinned knee, he would pass out. And he couldn't bear the sight of suffering. He was very timid in that respect. So becoming a physician was not a good option. So his father decided instead to send Darwin on to the other respectable profession for a young man of his background, which was to become a clergyman. Now, it seems to us highly ironic today that Charles Darwin was intending to become a clergyman. But in order to become a clergyman in the state church, the Church of England, you first had to get a BA degree from an English university. So obviously Edinburgh was out, and so Darwin went instead to Cambridge, which was in those days, and well, it still is, a small town located in beautiful countryside. This is what it looked like in Darwin's day. And specifically, he went to this college, Christ's College. This is how it looked in the 1690s when this engraving was made, but it basically hadn't changed at all by the time Darwin went there. The college was founded in 1505, and this is what it looked like in Darwin's day. This is my favorite engraving, which is why it's on the cover of the book. It hasn't changed at all since those days, except for now you really shouldn't stand there because buses will run into you, compared to Darwin's day when they had sheep and cattle coming down the street. So Darwin went to Christ's College with the intention of becoming a clergyman. And here's the first myth I must set aside, which is that most books and magazines will tell you that Darwin studied theology at Cambridge, or divinity. That's not true. There was no divinity degree. He was registered for an ordinary BA degree because the BA degree was simply a prerequisite to later undertaking divinity training. So he did not study divinity or theology. His studies were identical to those of other undergraduates. In the college admissions book, on October 15th, 1827, Charles Darwin admitted a pensioner, which meant that was the type of student. A pensioner was one who could pay his own fees. There were this is another page from a different college record book, there were these different ranks of students in those days, with the highest rank being noblemen, those being the elder sons of the titled gentry, so you'd be an earl or something. And the next grade down, also in price, you see the difference, £81 to £44, were called fellow commoners. Well, these were students who were basically treated like fellows of the college because you paid more, so you got perks. So you got to sit with the fellows at high table, you got to sit with the fellows in chapel, got better food, better rooms, and a nicer gown. It was much, much nicer, but you had to be unbelievably rich to be fellow commoner. Darwin was a normal sort of student, a pensioner, which was still quite expensive those days, £15 a year. And there was one rank below that, sizers. You wouldn't want to be a sizer. The sizers were those who couldn't pay. They were poor. And they were there because someone had paid the money for them, or they got a scholarship, one of those two options. But you had a very shabby gown that showed that you were of the lowest rank, and they even had to serve other students at mealtimes, like waiters. And so the hierarchy was not an embarrassment in those days. It was absolutely explicit, and that was the way their world was built, hierarchically. Now, here's a picture of a Cambridge undergraduate from these days, just to give you an idea of what it was like. And there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, this is someone who's just got his BA degree, and so he's sporting his gown, which changes when you got a BA degree. But he's also actually showing off something else, which none of you will notice, because it's simply impossible. What is he sort of brandishing quite proudly? And it's not the watch fob that you might think there. No, he's showing off that he's wearing trousers, because this was the latest fashion. Until then, men had worn breeches, right, which ended at the knee. So wearing trousers was a radical new fashion in those days. So he's saying, check it out, I'm wearing trousers and I just got my degree. But the wearing of gowns is something interesting. This is from a fashion magazine of the day. The different colleges of Cambridge, there were about 30 colleges in those days, usually had different gowns. So you could tell just by looking which college someone was from and which rank they were, which type of student, or if they were a fellow of a college. So this is the gown of Christ's, where Darwin went. But the other thing about gowns is that they were mandatory. We now think of gowns as something you wear at graduation. That's the only time anyone ever sees a gown anymore. But they were required for every member of the university. Whenever you went outside your college walls into the street, you had to wear a gown. If you didn't, you could be fined, because that showed that you were up to something not okay. You were trying to go incognito and conceal the fact that you were a member of the university. So the gown always had to be worn. But, that's one other thing I want to tell you about gowns, which is that we all are familiar with gowns at graduation, but we've completely forgotten what they are. They're not just academical dress. Why do they look like this? It's because they are derived or descended from monks' habits. The institutions of Oxford and Cambridge and other universities were originally semi-monastic. They were religious institutions. So the clothing is one of many links. Many of the students did go on to be clergymen, and almost all of the fellows of the colleges were clergymen and forbidden to marry, which marriage in the Church of England is allowed, but not for fellows of colleges, because they were still a bit monk-like. There were still some vestiges of this. Well, new students went to this grand hall to sign up on the roll or register of the university, which is called a matricula, which is why it's called matriculation when you sign up to university. Well, this is the matriculation sheet where Darwin signed up, using unusually his full name, Charles Robert Darwin. And rather amusingly, the person who signed after him was called Richard Dawkins, but it's just a coincidence. There's no, I know of no connection there. Anyway, But what this means is that you had to swear by signing this document that you were a bona fide member of the Church of England. If you were any other sect of Christianity or not a Christian, you were barred from Cambridge. See, another one of these very serious religious links. So even though Darwin's father was a free thinker and his mother was a Unitarian, he had been baptized in the Church of England with this kind of social advancement in mind, that Oxford or Cambridge would be open to him. And so it was. Shortly after becoming a student, one of his friends, who was a fine artist, drew this joke coat of arms for Darwin. All right, it's not his real coat of arms, it's a joke. And if you look carefully, all of the emblems here have to do with drinking and smoking. So these are two mythological figures. They're puffing away, puff, puff, puff. Pipes here, beer barrel, tankards, and so forth. What is this all about? As far as we know, Darwin was not a boozer and a smoker. And I think the answer comes from the fact that when he first arrived in Cambridge, he was a few months late. Term had already started. All the rooms in college were full. So for a short time, he had to take lodgings in this private house across the street from the college, which is now demolished. But it was above the tobacconist. Maybe it was a joke. Since Darwin didn't drink and smoke a lot, why did his friend make a joke coat of arms about smoking and drinking being Darwin's coat of arms? That's a possibility, that it was a joke about living over the tobacconist for the first few months. But then he was able to move into a set of rooms in college. And this sheet of the recently discovered college bills shows Darwin and his presence, basically, as being recorded on the sheet, but also because residence was one of the requirements to get a degree, but also showing that he had to pay his rent. And this is where he lived. These are Darwin's rooms as they were photographed in 1909. And they look not bad, right, for undergraduate rooms. Well, in 2009, which was the bicentenary of Darwin, we wanted to restore Darwin's rooms to what they looked like. Well, there's no descriptions of what his rooms looked like, so we didn't have anything to go on, apart from drawings of other Cambridge undergraduate rooms at the same time. And actually, there are quite a few of those. But a lot of them turned out to be sort of joke cartoons like this one, where this is the student occupant of the room, and he's being imposed upon by everybody coming over and taking over his rooms, and apparently supposedly wasting his time. Most of them show this, the typical fate of an industrious student, working hard in the first term, studying, and then, whoa, drunken layabout in the next semester. There he is, lying on his sofa, smoking and drinking, getting drunk and not working hard. Not that any students do this anymore, but this was the joke about Cambridge undergraduates, was that they all succumbed to this fall from grace. They started out working hard, but eventually they became drunken layabouts. The other thing is, of course, Cambridge was only for men. There were no women, not one, absolutely not. And of course, there were no girlfriends. There was nothing. But boys being boys, sometimes there were. So this cartoon represents an undergraduate who's been caught by the university police, who's called a proctor. And the caption at the bottom says, "Quite unexpected." That is, the proctor came into his room quite unexpected and caught him with a lady on his lap. So he would have been fined or maybe even thrown out of the university for having a girl in his rooms. But this picture really gives us a good idea of what undergraduate rooms would look like in those days. So that helped us with the reconstruction. This is what Darwin's rooms looked like before we began. They're basically just, they're still used for teaching, for supervisions, and they were basically bare oak panels, but that's not what they look like in Darwin's day. That, as far as we know, is what they look like in Darwin's days. Very grand, very elegant, very, very elegant space. Here it is from another angle. And this is just his sitting room. And the thing, when I show students this today, they can't believe that such a huge room was just for one student. Well, it was. This is his little sleeping chamber at the back. So this is where he hosted friends to dinner parties, occasionally did some studying, apparently, but these were Darwin's rooms. Looking out the window, which is actually just to the left of this photograph, this is the view. In fact, this engraving was done exactly at the time Darwin was at Christ's College. This is looking across the first court. This is the dining hall here, the Master's Lodge, and he's looking straight at his clerical future, the college chapel. So I'll just take you briefly through a day in the life of a Cambridge undergraduate in those days. It is surprising. It would start around 7 a.m. when the servant who was assigned to all the students on that staircase, called a gyp, which means a vulture, would come in and wake you up, help you dress, so that you could trundle across to chapel. Meanwhile, he would lay out your breakfast and start the fire. Another student would come and clean your shoes. Another servant would come and make your bed. And it was all done rather nicely for you. So after we went to chapel, in which they wore their gowns and so forth, something happened there that is previously unknown, which is that, and it's quite hard for us to imagine, one of the things that students did as part of their chapel service was that they rotated through, standing at the lectern at the front of the chapel and reading from the Bible to the collected members of the college. Now, this is an image previously unimaginable of Charles Darwin standing at the front of a chapel reading from the Bible, but he certainly did, as all the students did. In fact, there was even a prize offered by the college for the most graveful reader. By that, I think they meant the one who took it seriously. And this is the Chapel of Christ as it looked in those days. No, it's not one of the grandest colleges. After that, after breakfast, then there were a couple of hours of college lectures. And this is why an undergraduate at Cambridge needed to know Greek to quite a high level. So if you just have a look at that question, in what places in an iambic trimeter do the tragic poets admit, and so forth. I showed this to a classicist at Cambridge, and he said, gosh, I couldn't do that. And that was a classics professor today. Well, obviously the interests have changed, but nevertheless, the lectures that were carried on were at quite a high level, but they consisted mostly of classics and mathematics. This is a mathematics examination sheet on conic sections, also from exactly when Darwin was there. These were previously not discovered. But we know Darwin wasn't a very good student. He wasn't very interested in the studies. After the college lectures, there was free time for a while. And then at 4 was the main meal of the day. Dinner was served at 4 p.m. This is the dining hall at Christ's. So the undergraduates sat at these tables here, served by the sizers. And the meal in those days, going back to the Middle Ages, okay, you have to remember this is a medieval institution that's just still going on. The meal still consisted, written down. Your meal that you were entitled to, your commons, was a piece of meat and a glass of beer. That was it. That was the meal. I think it may be a piece of bread. So by the 1820s, this was a completely outdated sort of meal. Nobody would be satisfied with a piece of meat and a glass of very weak beer, by the way. So they weren't getting drunk. It was just that the water wasn't safe to drink. So by this time, there were additional things you could buy, but they weren't part of the amount of money you were already paying to the college. So the fact that people wanted, say, soup or vegetables in addition with their meals meant that they had to pay extra for those. And that came to light when we found the student bills, which showed for each student these extra columns of stuff that they bought in addition to their meals. So we can see there that Darwin went the whole hog and ate his vegetables. Okay, but what he was really interested in doing was not his studies, but was his growing interest in science, and particularly in collecting beetles. So this is a letter he wrote to his cousin, who was also at Christ's, talking all about beetles. And at the top here, you can see 3 drawings of beetles that he's collected, but these are drawn by his sister because Darwin couldn't draw to save his life. But he soon became sort of notorious as the one who collected beetles a lot. And so his friend, the one who drew the coat of arms, drew this cartoon, sort of making fun of him. It says on the left, Darwin and his hobby. And here he is sitting on a beetle. Go it, Charlie, with a milestone saying he's 1 mile away from Cambridge. And some of his Cambridge beetles still survive in collections today. This one was one of his favorite, called Crux major. One day Darwin was collecting in the countryside, and he had grabbed a beetle with one hand, and then he saw another really good one with the other hand and grabbed that. And then, perplexingly, he saw another beetle that was another species he hadn't collected yet, and he absolutely had to have that one, but he couldn't release the others. So, thinking fast, he popped one into his mouth and grabbed the other one. But unfortunately, the one they put in his mouth was a type of bombardier beetle and ejected some acid spray into his throat. So he coughed and lost all the beetles. But he didn't mind making fun of himself, so he used to tell this story in later years, that my zeal for catching beetles was so great that this happened to me. But the other thing about Darwin as a student is that he wasn't just, as I said at the beginning, don't think of him as the bearded old man. As the young man, the student, he had much wider interests. So I'll just show you one example of the kinds of prints that he avidly collected. You could get these near the Fitzwilliam Gallery on Fitzwilliam Street. This one is a drawing from the Italian Renaissance, and Darwin was very keen on studying both the style of paintings that were located throughout Cambridge. The older Darwin, had no interest whatsoever in art. It bored him to death. He said it made him literally sick, including literature. He said he picked up a volume of Shakespeare once and he thought he would vomit. He completely lost his interest in such things. But the young Darwin did have wider interests. He liked to go to King's College Chapel, here's the interior, and listen to the choir sing. And he once turned around to a friend and as the choir sang, and he said, "How's your backbone doing?" Showing that he was deeply affected. But all these things would be lost in later life. This was his mentor, Professor John Stevens Henslow, who had probably the greatest effect on Darwin, teaching him how to be a naturalist, how to collect, and about not just botany, as this particular slide wasn't a slide, these are posters. They didn't have PowerPoint back then, obviously. But they had big posters that were shown at the lecture hall at the front. And Darwin took Henslow's lectures as extras. These were not part of the curriculum, 3 years running. But the curriculum in those days for the university was separate from the college lectures I mentioned. But it was basically the same things. It was classics, mathematics, and philosophy. And at the end of the day, if you met the residency requirement of residing 11 terms in Cambridge, and that was all recorded, you couldn't sneak out, then you had only 2 other requirements, apart from paying your fees, which was to pass all of 2 examinations. That's it. The first go, the little go, and the final examination. Well, Darwin passed them both. In fact, with flying colours, he got a very high mark. And this is where degrees were then, and indeed today are still conferred in Senate House. This is a degree ceremony. And this is what it looks like close up, with a vice chancellor conferring the degree upon someone. And then, as you can see from the records of the university, he got to sign out, which meant he now had a BA degree. This would have been the time when Darwin could have gone off and undertaken divinity training and headed on to a future of being a clergyman. But as we all know, that didn't happen. A little something called the Voyage of the Beagle got in the way, and Darwin went off and became a naturalist, a scientist for the rest of his life, and the idea of being a clergyman was just silently dropped. Oh, and by the way, just a couple of weeks ago at NUS, we launched a new project which reconstructed the entire library on board Darwin's ship, his scientific library. We reconstructed it electronically and put it online, where it's now free. Okay. So that's Darwin's Cambridge life. Now, in the remaining half of my talk, I'll talk about the other man who's not so well known. That is Alfred Russel Wallace. This is a cartoon from 2009, which is kind of making fun of the fact that in 2009, the world was covered with Darwin anniversary events. And so this cartoonist is saying, oh, well, poor Wallace is being left out. I don't agree with that because it was a Darwin anniversary, not a Wallace anniversary. Wallace just had his own anniversary in 2013. Wallace is a character quite different from Darwin in many ways, including what we know about him and including how well he is studied. So Darwin has been studied by historians intensively for over 100 years. So to find new things about Darwin is quite difficult. So the part of his life when he was a student at Cambridge was something about which not much had been done. So I was able to find out new things there. But for Wallace, it was very different. Wallace has been the preserve of amateurs, non-historians, for most of the time that people have been writing about him. So there's lots of biographies about Wallace, but they've been written by people who haven't done the same kind of research and aren't as familiar with the social context as Darwin. So Wallace's life turns out to be very different in his story. So first of all, people always stress how different Wallace was from Darwin. Darwin was very rich, never had to work a day in his life. True. But then they say Wallace was working class and had to struggle against the glass ceiling in Victorian Britain and so forth. False. Wallace was not working class. His father was also a gentleman, like Darwin's, but it was a family which had lost their money. Here are Wallace's parents. These are gentlefolk. His father was a gentleman, as he is recorded in several original documents, including Wallace's birth certificate. That was his profession. And the profession of being a gentleman in those days meant you didn't work, because that was respectable. He had enough money not to work, although he lost it. They look like characters straight out of a Jane Austen novel, okay? And they would be. But their family's finances had suffered, so they had moved to this little cottage on the border with Wales because the living there was quite cheap. But still quite a nice house. And as far as Wallace could remember, they had at least one servant when he was born. Next thing that is not a difference, as usually told, it's described how Wallace went to the Hartford Grammar School and that he was forced to leave early because his parents' money ran out. But that's not true. This is a legend. I don't know where it comes from. It's simply not true. Wallace went to school to the proper leaving age. He did not have to leave early. He left at the age of 14. That was the normal age. The other thing is that Wallace's school was much more upmarket than had been previously realized. This was also a public school, Hartford Free Grammar School. It's basically in the same rank as Darwin's. It advertised itself in the newspapers as a school for the sons of gentlemen. There were schools for poor boys in Wallace's town, but he didn't go to one of those. So his parents scraped every last penny together they could to give Wallace a good education. But there was no money after that. So university was not an option, unless, of course, he had won a scholarship. So no, Wallace didn't get to go to university. But he did have an interest in science. And in those days, there were no jobs in science. But the Victorians were obsessed with collecting natural history objects. These great museums throughout Europe and America were stuffed full of dead things from all over the world. Well, how do you get dead things from all over the world? You have to have people to collect them. Well, indeed, you have to have people to kill them and collect them and bring them back. That meant there was a market for getting natural history objects from around the world. And that is the profession that Wallace chose. He and another friend sailed for Brazil, where Wallace collected for 4 years, had put together a very nice cache of collections. But alas, this is what happens when you travel third class. Ship caught fire, everything was burned and destroyed. He lost everything. But they were saved in the ship's boats. He came back to England and, judging from this photograph, fattened up a bit, preparing for the next expedition. He wanted to go and do it again, but this time do it properly. That is, to go on another expedition. And another one, the next one was, of course, to Southeast Asia, where he arrived here. In fact, right over there, exactly right over there, on the 18th of April, 1854, when he arrived on the monthly P&O steamer. as they're set off throughout the region. This is a map from his book, and the lines indicate all the different voyages. He went to all these different islands, and, well, to not put too fine a point on it, killing lots and lots of things. That's what a collector does. So these are all illustrations of birds actually collected by Wallace. These aren't just random pictures. But his collection eventually was 125,000 different things, mostly insects, but also birds and some mammals. So this is just to give you just a brief overview of the kinds of things that Wallace was collecting. So beautiful birds from all over the region. Gorgeous butterflies and beetles. He discovered many new species, hundreds of new species. Not so many mammals, and also shells, snail shells. They would take the snail out and throw it away, because that would rot. But a snail shell won't rot, and that was part of the collecting market. And many collectors in London and elsewhere had cabinets full of beautiful snail shells from around the world. So they were worth a few pennies each. So he had lots of adventures. This is a scene from Wallace's book showing, depicting one story he tells about a giant python that was found in his hut. And a local man, his own this is supposedly Wallace, his own helpers all ran away when they saw the snake. They were afraid. And, well, so did Wallace, because he also went outside. But they found a local man who was apparently not too afraid of pythons, whose technique was simple but brilliant. He poked at the python until it uncoiled a bit. He grabbed the end of its tail, put it over his shoulder, and ran out of the house. And the python didn't have time to curl around furniture or anything. And so they got it outside, and, well, basically they whacked it against a tree, and then they chopped its head off. Now, that's an adventure, okay? I mean, if it happened to you, you would tell your friends about it for years. But it's not, it's not something you would put in the movies. But it's perfectly plausible. Unlike this one. Now, this is another naturalist named Albert Bickmore, who was traveling in Southeast Asia at almost the same time as Wallace. And he also told a giant python story, but a rather different one. Bickmore was on board his ship, ready to sail home, and someone had given him a giant python in a box, but somehow it got out. And he tells the story at the very end of his book. He wanted to finish with a bang with his book, about how he was forced to get into the ship's boat where the snake was in his pajamas, and he describes the blow-by-blow account of how for 15 minutes there was a life or death struggle between himself, armed only with an axe. I mean, I can't feel sorry for him, against a snake, which is impossible. You could not prolong a fight with a snake for 15 minutes if you have an axe. I mean, chop. That's it. So he dragged it out to sex up his story and make it more dramatic for his readers, as he did throughout his book. But this is not Wallace's style at all. Wallace is much more modest, plain speaking, and you can rely on him. He's an honest man. One of Wallace's major discoveries, what's still called the Wallace line, this is from his own map published in 1863. The Wallace line is basically an invisible line on the map that separates Australian families of animals on the eastern side from Asian families on the other side. Now, the reason this is special or dramatic is that ordinarily, well, in fact, no, in every other case in the world, when you have such unrelated families of things as Australian and Asian, they are separated by a huge ocean or some other vast barrier. But only in this one case, they're not separated by anything. They come very close together. In fact, at Bali and Lombok, you can actually see across the strait from one island to another. And yet they have utterly unrelated animals on either side. The climate is the same. The soil, the ground seemed the same. The vegetation is the same. What was the explanation? Well, Wallace and his Victorian contemporaries couldn't really answer this. Wallace thought that this was the result of two giant continents, a super Australia and a super Asia, that had sunk. Each one had, because they knew about geological subsidence and uplift. So if these continents had sunk, and what we see today are just the remaining mountaintops of what had always been separated continents, then he thought, that would explain this strange puzzle. We now know that the continents don't just go up and down, but they also move around. So the reason these utterly unrelated things are right next door to each other is that the Australian families of things have come from South America. Australia and South America used to be connected, which is why the only marsupials in the world outside Australia live in South America, which was a big puzzle in Wallace's day. Hugely separated, how could that be? But Wallace pushed on beyond these discoveries to the small islands called the Moluccas, up here just next to New Guinea, where he was in range of the most lucrative birds of all, the birds of paradise, some of the most beautiful birds in the world, and very rare, very hard to get to in those days, and very, very expensive. So Wallace was very keen on getting copies of them. And the farthest you could go in those days on the steamships. This is a map from a book, actually put online by the National Library, thank you very much, which shows the steamer routes to the Dutch East Indies in those days. And the furthest point was here at the tiny island of Ternate. Well, it was on this island that Wallace had the great eureka moment of his life, and the part of his life that has been told thousands and thousands of times. This is a scene from a documentary. He's lying in bed with a tropical fever, probably malaria, and in the midst of his sweating, he suddenly has an idea about species. And famously, when he wakes up, he writes it down and sends it, of all the people in the world, to Charles Darwin, someone he'd been corresponding with. Okay, this is where I'm going to start diverging from what people usually say about Wallace. This is Darwin's notebook, where he first sketches out his idea. Was it the same theory as Darwin's? It's so easy to say that someone has the same idea as someone else, but the closer you look at what they've actually written, the closer you look at their notes, the more differences you find. And that's the case with Darwin and Wallace. So I really don't know what language to use. I usually say very similar, because to use the word same is too sloppy and just too inaccurate. Never use the word same, and you'll be safer. But if you use the word same, someone will show you some differences. And, well, there they are. There are differences. So they're very similar theories, but they wouldn't be the same. Now, what about the mystery of why did he send it to Charles Darwin? Everyone, Wallace's admirers today say, why didn't he just send it to a journal, and then he would have been first? Well, the reason is that they didn't see it that way in those days. He wasn't trying to be first with anything. A modern person would say that he found the mechanism for evolution. But this is not the way they thought in Victorian times. They didn't use the word mechanism. They weren't searching for a solution to a problem. They didn't see it in that way. So Wallace had come up with what he thought was a new way of explaining how different types of living things adapted to their environments. And it was talking about evolution of a sort. But Wallace didn't send that for publication. Instead, he sent it to Charles Darwin, who he knew already was working on a book on evolution. And he knew that Darwin had been working on this book for 20 years. So he knew Darwin was sympathetic. He sent it to the only sympathetic person he knew. The only thing we know about Wallace's thoughts at the time is from this retrospective letter to a friend, where he said about his theory, I had the idea of working it out so far as I was able when I returned home. In other words, he wasn't prepared to complete a theory at the moment. It was something he would work on when he got home. That was 4 or 5 years away. But anyway, something unexpected happened. He received this letter from Charles Darwin, which praised Wallace's previous work very highly, and this gave Wallace the idea to send it to Darwin. And this moment when Darwin receives Wallace's essay with the same or very similar theory is a very famous moment in the history of science. In 1959, it was the subject of this oil painting. But here's another thing that you see. The way we tell stories about history also evolve. They change. Pick any story you want. Read the same history of some event or some person back in time. 10, 15, 20, 50, 100, 150, as far as you want, and you will find that the story changes over time. So that might be because new evidence has been found, or it might be for some other reasons. So in the case of this Wallace and Darwin story, it's not because any new evidence has been found. It's just evolved in a way that has made it more dramatic. It has made it better television, basically. So this is a scene of Darwin receiving the letter in the 2001 documentary. Look at the expression on his face and compare that to this one. In this one, Darwin is saying, how interesting. And in this one, Darwin is saying, oh dear, he's very worried. And in this one, from 2009, he's saying, oh God! He's literally in tears. His wife is trying to keep him from committing suicide or something. It is dramatically changed. And this is the way it is portrayed, as if, with the arrival of this letter, something terrible has happened to Charles Darwin. Well, that's not the way people used to see it. The way they used to see it was these two gentlemen had exchanged views and said, how interesting, and began to correspond more, right? But now it's represented as some sort of conflict, as if there were some stakes. And this has been the basis for many conspiracies, particularly the idea that Darwin lied about when he received the letter, and for whatever nefarious reasons. My colleague, Kees Ruckmacher, and I, a couple of years ago, disproved that forever. We showed exactly how the letter went through the mail system and got to Darwin's house exactly on the day he said it did. So that, one should think, would be left, but the conspiracy theorists never stop. Even when you disprove everything they've said, they continue saying, well, it still arrived on a different day. But no historian will take that seriously again. The other one is that Darwin borrowed or plagiarized something from Wallace's work. This has been very persistent. And when you tell something that nasty about someone, it sticks, even when there's no evidence for it at all. Just hearing it is very memorable. When I meet people who have barely heard the name Wallace, or not even sure what his name is, but they've heard of Darwin, the other one, Wallace, oh yes, isn't he the one that Darwin stole from? That's the only thing that people know about the story, usually, because it's just more dramatic. But alas, there's absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. And furthermore, we have such a detailed paper trail for Darwin's views throughout all those years that there's simply no room for looking for any mysterious sources for any of them. We can see them all evolving in his notes. So what happened was that Darwin's gentlemanly friends decided that the polite thing to do would be to publish, or what would be to read at a scientific meeting, writings by both men, and then to publish them together. Then there would be no priority dispute. They would be publishing these ideas jointly at the same time. And that's what happened. And for all those living in those days, this was the most respectable, the most perfect solution to this difficulty. But nowadays it's described as a dirty deed, as something sinister, and wicked, and even possibly illegal. But if you go back in time to the original sources, it's absolutely mundane and normal. There's no issue whatsoever. One of my critics has been contradicting me over and over again. I dare you to show one other instance of this happening. So I showed him another instance, and he said, well, that one doesn't count. So that's all you can do. Wallace is also described as being unhappy, disgruntled, injured in this whole story. But just look at what he said to his own mother the day he found out about the reading of his paper together with Darwin's. He said to her, I have received letters from Mr. Darwin and Dr. Hooker, two of the most eminent naturalists in England, which has highly gratified me. I sent Mr. Darwin an essay on a subject in which he is now writing a great work. This ensures me the acquaintance and assistance of these eminent men on my return home. And indeed it did. But this nagging old question will always remain. If they publish at the same time, if they shared credit in this way, why has nobody heard of Wallace? Why is Darwin so famous? It still sounds like something's wrong, that something unfair has happened. Again, this is a modern view that nobody ever thought of many decades ago. Only dates from about the 1970s. This recent documentary by the comedian Bill Bailey, I can't watch it. I mean, it's funny because he's a great comedian. I really like him as a comedian, but he's a terrible historian. He hasn't a clue what was going on in those days, and he is full of injury and feels so angry that that Wallace is so overlooked and so forth, and he feels that he has to right this wrong. But it's a wrong that is imagined, that didn't exist in those days. So, for example, he says things like, it was known as a joint theory for decades. Nope, that's simply not true. And Wallace was robbed of his priority. In other words, because Wallace wrote down a draft of an essay paper, Bailey and others think that he has some priority over Darwin, who also has an unpublished thing, and has had it for 20 years. I don't see how two people with unpublished things can have one. Unless you go by date, how can you say Wallace has priority? But then they get around that by saying, well, but his is written for publication and Darwin's wasn't. Anyway, these are all modern issues which I think are completely uninteresting. Have nothing to do with Victorian times or with the real human beings that once existed, Darwin and Wallace. They had never dreamt of any of these issues. And the clear, plain, mundane, undeniable historical fact that answers this question, why is Darwin so famous, is simply this, that the year after the joint reading, Darwin finished his book on his theory, The Origin of Species. And this book almost single-handedly generated this scientific revolution that people nowadays call the Darwinian Revolution. Within 20 years, the international scientific community had accepted that evolution was a fact, and all of those people were converted by Darwin's work, his mountain of evidence, his mountain of arguments, his detailed consideration of objections and so forth, none of which Wallace had. All of those people read Darwin, were convinced by him, and attributed the credit to him of being the one who convinced the reader, convinced us that evolution is a fact. So it's not about priority or firstness. It's who did the work of convincing the world of this new theory. Wallace himself never disputed any of this. In fact, I could be paraphrasing Wallace myself in everything I've just said. He said, Wallace himself published his great book, The Malay Archipelago, a few years after he returned home in 1869. It's still in print today, lots of editions out there, but I caution you to wait until later this year when my edition comes out. lots of footnotes with new stuff that wasn't previously known about Wallace's book, but it's wonderful. It's available online for free. It's everywhere, and it's a wonderful read. And the chapter on Singapore is fascinating. In fact, read it, and you'll be surprised that quite a few of the things he said then are still true today. But have a look yourselves. After Darwin's death in 1882, Wallace wrote his own great work on evolution, which he called Darwinism, because he insisted on using Darwin's name to characterize the theory as a whole. And this, I would say, is next to the second only to The Origin of Species as a work on the theory of evolution by natural selection, not just in Victorian times, but even until today. It's a remarkably clear overview of the evidence and how we know how life on Earth has unfolded since it began. So let me describe this, what I call Wallace hagiography. Hagiography is telling the life stories of saints. So here I've made Saint Wallace out of what was originally Saint George. And this is what you will find, what I find is in common in all of these stories that treat Wallace as a hero who has been wronged. They all have this in common. He was hugely disadvantaged, right? He had to leave school early. He was somehow cheated or wronged, either stolen from or something. He's been forgotten because of his low birth or status or wealth compared to Darwin. His rich, high status, everything going for him. But then on the other hand, Wallace has all these superlative achievements. And these are things that are said of him in very recent years. Again, go back and read old accounts of Wallace. They say none of these things. The praise of Wallace gets stronger every year. So he's now called the greatest collector of Victorian times. I don't know where that comes from. He was the greatest evolutionist. He was the father of biogeography. It's the Wallace line and so forth. He wasn't a racist like Darwin. He was the most famous scientist in the world when he died and so forth. All of these things are utter nonsense. Easily refuted. No historian takes them seriously whatsoever. But every time I mention one of these things in print that, it's often said that this is the case, but it's not true, I get a flurry of blog and internet attacks. How dare you attack our hero and so forth. I'm not attacking Wallace. I'm attacking falsehood. I'm standing for historical accuracy. So the idea that his reputation must be restored and so forth is a sort of moral view. It's an activist's view. It's not a historian's view. It's not a historian's game to restore things. So let me just give you a historical comparative example. So the idea, I mean, it seems quite plausible. Darwin was so wealthy and well-connected and so forth that he's remembered and so forth, but the lower-born, poorer Wallace is forgotten. It seems to make sense, but only when you treat it in isolation. If you actually compare to other people, you find that it makes no sense whatsoever. Lots of other scientists or naturalists from Victorian times, and indeed people who were not scientists like Charles Dickens, all of these people were much more famous than Wallace during Wallace's lifetime. And all of them came from poorer backgrounds than Wallace. So having a poor background, being of lower class, was not the limit that Wallace's modern fans say it was. That's simply not true. I think what has more to do with it was Wallace's belief in some pretty wacky Victorian movements. Phrenology, he never gave up his belief for this and became very public, that you could read the bumps on people's heads and read their characters. This was completely discredited by the end of the 19th century. Wallace never gave up his belief. He became avid in the anti-vaccination movement. He claimed that vaccinating children caused vastly more deaths, despite the fact that the statistics from all over Europe and America showed overwhelmingly that smallpox and some other things had vastly diminished since vaccination started. So he tarnished his reputation by supporting these things. Then there was mesmerism, the idea that you can magnetically influence people by shooting out invisible magnetic rays from your hands. It's a precursor of hypnotism. And probably worst of all was Wallace's deep and continued promotion, openly, in publications, of the spiritualist movement. This is where seances, table turnings, Ouija boards, that sort of thing, comes from this late Victorian movement, which they called spiritualism, which was they believed that mediums could be in contact with spirits from another world. So these are, I have not faked these. These are original photographs of Wallace with ghosts, as he believed. In fact, they're fakes. He was fooled by the photographers and mediums who have used what today is a really simple trick. I mean, we've got Photoshop now, but in those days, they did a double exposure. So they exposed a figure of a woman on the plate, half exposed, and they put Wallace in a chair and made sure that the negative was moved over so you wouldn't completely obscure his face, and then exposed it and took the picture of Wallace. Same here. Wallace's faith in these things was so blind that this one, where he was supposedly photographed with his dead mother's ghost, Wallace said, "It's very curious. You know, she looks nothing like my mother. What does that show you?" And Wallace said, "It shows us that spirits look different from the living person." For him, it was not evidence that it was simply not his mother, that it was an actress or someone else. At the very last pages of his autobiography, My Life, published in 1905, he is impressing on the reader the importance of believing in spiritualism. So he tells a story of how he went to a seance, and he, being very scientific and he thought very skeptically minded, he checked the room very carefully. He looked for trap doors and any secret passages. And the medium was going to be put in a little alcove at the back of the room. And they would put her in a chair. Mediums were usually women. And they would tie her up with ribbons, because rope is a bit too unfeminine. So they used ribbon, silk ribbon. So they tied her up with silk ribbon and put a curtain across. And then the lights go out, and you know, the spirits are coming, and everyone is sitting around the table holding hands and so forth. And then something happened. Through the curtain, in the dim light of the room, they could just see what looked like a ghostly hand coming through the curtain with a note. And someone collected this note, and then the hand disappeared. And then the lights went back on, and they pulled back the curtain, and there was the medium tied up with their hands still in ribbons. And this is what Wallace told his readers. To astound us, the note was not in the medium's handwriting. Therefore, it must have been written by a ghost. Now, when I read that, Wallace, who was so intelligent and who discovered so many things, I can't stop scratching my head. What? How can that be good evidence that a ghost wrote it? Because it's in different handwriting? I mean, it could have been written by millions of people. That's a pretty mundane, simple explanation. Why do you prefer that it was written by a spirit? But that is what he believed. And I think it was the fact that he turned away from science so much at the end of his life and promoted these other things that were very controversial and sometimes even extremely embarrassing. One other case, a famous American medium was touring London, and some skeptics, two scientists that in Wallace's community, wanted to catch him. So they went along to a seance pretending to be believers. And during the seance, lights went out, and they had two slates, which are essentially two blackboards with little wooden frames, which are put one on top of the other. So because of the frames, there's a little gap between the blackboards, in between the two stacked on top of each other. And they would put a tiny piece of chalk inside so that the spirit could come and move the chalk around in the sealed space between the two slates and write a message from the spirit world. I don't know why a spirit can't just write on the blackboard, but anyway, that's the way they have to do it. They're shy. So the lights go out, the slate's in the middle, everyone's holding hands so no one can cheat, right? It's completely dark, and then they can hear, the scratching, the writing is going on. Well, this is when the scientists pull their trick. Bang! One of them slams his hand down on the slates. Lights go on, and there's the medium's finger caught between the slates. And he had a piece of chalk under his fingernail, which he used to write. So they caught him cheating, and they took him to court. There was a law against, not against this, but against card tricks or something, but basically lying to people to get their money. And they said this medium knows he's not talking to spirits because he's faking it. In the court case, one of the few people who appeared as a witness for the defense was Alfred Russel Wallace. He said that the phenomena is real, and it's not fair to disrespectfully interrupt the proceedings in this way and so forth. Again, tarnishing his reputation. We now know, secretly, behind the scenes, a little bit of money was collected for the prosecution, and one of those who gave a few pounds was Charles Darwin. So unbeknownst to one another, well, Darwin would have known, they were opposing different sides on this spiritualist debate. So it's, to us, it's funny and hard to understand, but it was something that was taken seriously by Wallace and others at his time, and I think has something to do with his fall into a comparative obscurity. But the main point, irrespective of Wallace's wacky interests at the end of his life, is that Darwin, once he published The Origin of Species, and over the 20 years of fighting over it that followed, was a figure unparalleled in fame and respect at the end of the Victorian period. There was no figure in the world who approached his fame, even close. And so ever since then, he's remained a well-known figure. Wallace was well-known at the time, and after he died, he was forgotten. But this is what his admirers say is, something strange and sinister has happened. Well, I don't think so. Pick any other famous man of science from those days, and it's exactly the same. You haven't heard of any of them. They're all forgotten, including those who were more famous than Wallace. In 100 years, all the famous scientists alive today will also be forgotten, I guarantee. It's extremely rare that a figure remains well-known after such a long period of time. So there's nothing mysterious about Wallace's case. Yes, it would be good that we promote the memory of Wallace and so forth, but we shouldn't do so by saying things that are wrong, and we shouldn't do so by making accusations against people who didn't do anything wrong. So I'd like to end on a positive note, which is, just think of it this way. Wallace and Darwin, friends now and always. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. John. It was quite exciting. So we open questions to the floor. Do you have any questions for Dr. John? Yeah.
Thank you for that interesting talk. I have a question regarding last week on spiritual. Where did the church stand in all of this?
That's a good question. Because spiritualism was a popular movement, it wasn't a church, it wasn't an official organization, it was sort of a fad that people were into. I don't think there really was an official church position. This did not really back up the established religions. You might think, well, it's spiritual and they believe in an afterlife and so forth, but they believed in a different one. If you read what these mediums were actually saying and so forth, they were creating a new religion in which they talked about the other side and the spirit world and so forth. This was not heaven or hell. It was new. They were making up a new version. So it neither supported or really went against the existing churches. So they kind of stayed separate from each other. Every clergyman that you would have talked to or every bishop would have had a different opinion. But basically they stayed apart from this. This is a popular movement which started in America, I think in the 1840s, by two sisters who started the whole spiritualist movement of manifesting spiritual presences. And the eldest one, when she died, just before she died, not after, admitted that they had faked it, that they had made the sounds by clicking their toes inside their shoes under the table to make this knocking sound, which is why table knocking remained a very prominent part of what spirits were supposed to do, was knocking on tables. So anyway, the church didn't particularly oppose or support spiritualism. It's quite a separate movement.
Okay, and the other somewhat related question is Wallace and Darwin. As Darwin became more and more prominent, did he also get some attention from the church? What did the church say about it?
Yes.
What about vision?
In fact, yes, that's the famous episode of Wilberforce versus Huxley. Again, there was no official church response to Darwin's work, just like there had been no official church response to geologists saying the Earth was millions of years old. These things were no longer, there was no official church reply or response or even position on this, really. It was up to the individual clergyman. And many clergymen were accepting Darwin. Well, a famous example is Bishop Samuel Wilberforce from Oxford, who, and this is another one of these stories that's been told a million times, that at a scientific meeting, Wilberforce mockingly says to a supporter of Darwin named Huxley, do you claim to be descended from an ape on your grandmother or your grandfather's side? So making fun of him for believing the absurd idea that humans come from apes. But that's just a legend, as well, as far as we know. We don't really know what happened. There was some sort of argument, there was some mention of grandmothers and apes and so forth. We don't have all the exact words. What we have now is a sort of victor story. Victors write the history, they say. And so what repeat is the one told by Huxley himself in letters and in later recollections, in which he sounds fantastic, which is just what you sound like when you tell us the story of an argument you had with somebody later on to your friends. You have exactly the cutting reply that completely refutes what that other person was saying. But in fact, at the time, you didn't put it quite so well and so forth. When I read Huxley's account of this event, it reads to me like one of those, that he's got it just right. But I think at the time it was not that many people could hear what was going on and so forth. So the idea that this traditional story is used to tell, gives us an impression that there were religious people on one side and scientists on the other. This is a very mistaken view, because first of all, most of the scientists in those days were religious. As you saw in the Darwin in Cambridge, all of his professors were clergymen, including his science professors, botanists and the geologists and so forth. So the scientific community that eventually, after lots of debate, that accepted Darwin's theory were mostly religious. It wasn't a case of secular people sort of winning an argument or people giving up their religion. This is the way it's imagined nowadays. But in fact, it was a case of people coming to terms with this new scientific theory and melding it together with their existing religious beliefs, something that Victorians, I think, were much better at than people are nowadays. We tend to always hear the stories in which there's two sides. There's this one and that one, and it's this versus that. But how could Charles Darwin, with only one book, convince a world that was vastly more religious than today's? The world is quite secular today. The world that Darwin lived with, the public, was much more religious, proportionally. How could his book have been successful in 20 years? Because it wasn't a case of accepting or denying your religion. It was a case of accepting or not this particular new scientific theory. And they'd been doing that for decades already, with geology, with astronomy, and so forth. It's harder to imagine this more complicated past world in which it's not science versus religion, as we tend to hear.
So, but then how do you, suppose now, from Darwin's day, we come back to today, parts of America. How does the church there relate to Darwinism, and how does Darwinism relate to evolution? I mean, essentially the same or related?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part of your question?
If we return to today from
Yes.
the days of Darwin,
Yeah.
in the days of Darwin, you said this theory of Darwinism was extremely influential. It convinced everybody except
Yes.
few
Okay.
odd ones in the church,
Yeah.
or even the church,
Yes.
whatever. But today, we read time and time again that there are vast stretches of the USA
Yes.
in which evolution theory should not is banned in schools.
Yeah. Okay, I can answer your question now.
So, but what's this evolution? How does it relate to Darwinism? Is it essentially the same or
Yes, it's essentially the same.
And how come the much more religious world then could accept Darwinism?
Yes.
And yet today, right, we see all this banning of
Yeah.
evolution.
Yeah, this is something that that is told by the media, I think, very badly. Yes, there are vast tracts of America where evolution is considered very controversial, considered completely a lie and a conspiracy and evil and all sorts of things. What no one ever reveals is that this is not something that has been going on ever since Darwin. This is the result of a new rise of an evangelical and fundamentalist movement in America in the early part of the 20th century. So these sects, which became very popular and numerous, opposed a lot of things about modern science and wanted to return to what they saw as their fundamental literal reading of what they thought was the original Christianity. So that was their version. So they rejected lots of modern things, particularly evolution. So that's where that has come from. The important thing to remember is that that evolutionary science has never, ever been disputed or in doubt amongst the scientific community since Darwin's day to today. I mean, today it is debated as gravity, or that the Earth goes around the sun. I mean, that used to be a hotly debated religious issue. Does the Earth go around the sun, or the sun around the Earth? And now that's over. No one would debate that anymore, right? We know it's finished, and it's no longer a religious issue. And I think someday the same will be true with evolution. We know with just as much certainty now that evolution has happened. And still happens. We're watching it all around us right now in all of our universities, in all the scientific departments all around the world. It's still controversial for some people, but I think eventually it will no longer be an issue. It's a case of accommodation and compromise, and these things take time.
Were there many explanations for why different creatures were evolving into different creatures at the same time? So was Darwin and Wallace just looking at one possible explanation for the many reasons why you saw different creatures?
Yes, that's a good question. There were different theories at the time. So we tend to think nowadays that there's just two versions. There's evolution and creation. No, it wasn't like that. the scientific community before Darwin didn't think that species were created by God at one time. They didn't believe that anymore. They believed that they knew from the geological record, which by then was pretty well known, they knew that new species had appeared tens of thousands of times over the geological record of the history of the Earth. So the question was, they knew why species kept vanishing. They're extinct. They're dead. We never see them again. The question they were puzzling over is, where do all the new ones come from in each new layer of the rocks? There kept being new species. And this process happened in a non-random way, in which they thought was very progressive. That is, in the oldest rocks were very simple, basic things, like shells, mussels, fish with no bones, and so forth. And as you went up through the geological record towards the present, there were fish, there were reptiles, there were mammals, and so forth, right? So how to explain this? So Darwin and Wallace's was one way, but there were other theories that new species were somehow either divinely created in each new geological age. That was one view, a minority view. Another was that there were other naturalistic explanations. So, for example, that new species simply are born from an old one at once. So, for example, they thought it was very popular that embryos could radically change inside a mother. So some say we're talking about an animal, okay? Don't think about people because that's upsetting. Let's say we're talking about a squirrel, okay? And that a squirrel's embryo could radically change from being a squirrel embryo to being some higher form of mammal. And a new species would thus be born in a naturalistic way. That was one very popular theory. And there were sort of combinations of those that I've just mentioned. So Darwin's and Wallace's was competing against those views. And it won out very quickly.
I think it must seem perplexing that someone like Wallace, who's such a man of science, to embrace spiritualism as he did. Have you speculated why this is so? Try to do a kind of a factual analysis of his past to maybe explain away, explain why this is so.
Yes, that's a very difficult question. Wallace was also raised in the Church of England like Darwin, and we know that when he was a teenager, he was exposed to more radical secular groups, and he gave it up. He became a free thinker. So all the time that he was a scientist, he was a free thinker, until after he got home, suddenly he gets into this, and it's so different from his previous beliefs. And a lot of people are trying to explain why does he do this. We don't know. But I think it's not a coincidence, maybe, that it happened just after the most traumatic, emotional event in Wallace's life, which was, to put it bluntly, he was dumped. His fiancée, with whom he was deeply enamored, simply dumped him. She just took off, and he never saw her again. No goodbye, nothing. And he was heartbroken. And shortly after that, he gets into this. Maybe this offered some kind of solace. I don't know. I'm not sure that we will ever know. But the second answer to your question is that, again, we shouldn't look at it as one or the other, as two things. Wallace looked at this and described it in his books as a scientific topic. He urged his fellow scientists to take this seriously as a matter for scientific investigation. Here is evidence, he said. We have writing appearing, flowers appear on tables, messages come from somewhere. This is evidence, he says, and it can't be explained by science as we now know it. So we should investigate it as scientists and discover new laws of nature and so forth, and widen our view of science to accept this. So that's how Wallace saw it. He thought he was being scientific. He would have disagreed very strongly if we said he wasn't being scientific. But that was Wallace's view, but many of his other colleagues, like Darwin, would not have agreed. They would have said that it wasn't science. So people always disagree.
So I don't know whether this is a fair question to ask you. I read that Dawkins says traits like altruism And also moral uprightness are evolutionary traits. But I would have thought that if you are altruistic, you would sacrifice yourself to save others. And, so where does this evolutionary traits come
Yes, yes.
Because for the survival of the fittest, I'm sure that we will favor the ruthless, right?
Well, that's exactly the question. Is it right or not? And it depends on which living thing you're talking about. So it just so happens that for many species, to be selfish and nudge everyone else out is the right thing to do, and they will have more offspring and they will do better. But in some social species, in which you have social groups, in which the society, your group, is composed of your relatives, that selfish strategy actually does not work best over the long term. And so many kinds of social animals, not just us, have evolved various types of so-called altruism and generosity and so forth, even self-sacrifice and so forth. Mother animals throughout nature do that, right, for their offspring. But social animals that live in social groups will do this for other members of the group because it turns out they're often close relatives.
In one of your earlier slides, the slide was about the priority dispute between Wallace and Darwin.
Uh-huh.
You have one line there saying, but someone had really...
Oh, yes.
What's that?
Yes, I overlooked that. This is a man called Patrick Matthew. After Darwin's Origin of Species came out, some man that no one had ever heard of, named Patrick Matthew, wrote to the newspaper and said, I'd just like to say that I discovered this natural selection theory first, and it was in my book in 1831. But it was a book on trees, not a sort of major theoretical work. And in the appendix, at the end of his book on trees, were some reflections about how nature works, and it sounds very, very similar to Darwin and Wallace's view of natural selection. So the gentlemen that they were, Darwin, well, first he ordered a copy of the book right away to check. He wrote back to the same newspaper saying that I fully accept that he's preceded me. That's fine. I wasn't aware of his work. No one else was aware of his work, and so forth. But there's only one or two Patrick Matthew fans out there promoting him, but there are. In fact, there's a recent book by an activist who's trying to say, down with Wallace and Darwin. Patrick Matthew is the one. I mean, this will never end.
Is it possible to explain the gist of evolution such that the majority of people can understand it? The reason I ask this is when I hear things like this, that particularly from people from churches, they tend to think like this, that they tend to explain it this way, and I'm not so sure about the accuracy, but basically they're saying that how can an orange come from an apple? I suppose that cross species.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it seems like having difficulty, trying to understand that. But in the first place, I just wondered myself, that evolution, is it really, does it really require us to believe that man came from monkey? Or is it something more subtle than
Yeah. Well,
that's not really what evolution is saying?
The difficulty is that it's...
What does it say then? What is it saying?
Yeah. Evolution is actually nothing special. There's nothing happening in evolution, anything different than what's happening in this room right now. This is it. This is life. We're all alive, okay? And we all have ancestors who look really, really similar, but never identical. The fact that all life works this way, that living things create offspring which are very similar but not identical, and that in the struggles of life on Earth, sometimes it makes a big difference exactly how different something is, that some things live and some things die. And slight differences, slight changes over a very long period can accumulate to change one lineage into another, but so slowly and so gradually. This is an example Darwin gave, that if you could bring back everything that ever lived and line them up, parent to offspring, end to end, you could walk down this line. Let's use squirrels again, okay? You could walk down this line of squirrels for mile after mile and never see any abrupt change. But when you got, say, to this point, you'd say, whoa, the squirrels here look really different from the squirrels from where I started. Now they're big, fat, and brown, and they were cute and gray way back there. But the change would be so gradual from parent to offspring that you would see nothing. You could nowhere draw a line. That is evolution. So the trick is being able to do two things. One is to understand this process of just parents giving birth to offspring, and some living and some dying, and then passing on their characteristics on a time scale we all experience and understand, and then to reiterate that over a really long period of time, which we cannot understand or experience. Because the changes that people tend to talk about, like apples evolving into something or monkeys evolving into people, is a process that takes millions of years. I can't see a mountain eroding either, but they are eroding, just at such a slow rate that I can't see much of it happening now. But if you could fast forward for, say, 5 million years, you would see the mountain go shrink down, right, with time lapse. It's the same with evolution. You cannot see a process that takes that long on such a short time scale, unless, of course, you work on microorganisms like diseases, because they're evolving all around us very rapidly, which is why they keep evolving immunity to our drugs and so forth.
Okay, on that note, I'd like to thank Dr. John for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.